All right. Good morning. It is 10 after 10. Welcome to the Tuesday call. Today is all about flexibility and specifically some secrets. Some secrets that no one talks about, or at least that are not talked about enough, in my humble opinion. So, let's hope that audio is working. I don't have to re-record this. And we will get rocking. So, flexibility secrets. Look at that. My brother-in-law's wedding. We all got shirts. So you guys get to see the groomsman shirt. And of course, COVID-19 life, we're all staying inside and we're not really caring about what we wear. Anyways, flexibility secrets. Now, pelvic positioning is something that I didn't know too much about until 3 years ago. And there were some key discoveries I made along the way that sparked interest in flexibility anatomy. One, being a young adult with no dance, no gymnastics, and no real sport background, I knew that flexibility to me was a skill I would have to learn as an adult in the body that was very much on the other side of its changes, sort of young adult changes, puberty. The other thing specifically is that as you age, growth plates stop or slow changing drastically at 25, somewhere between 20 and 30 years old. All of the growth plates in the body slow down and stop. So joints are not changing. They're not as adaptable as they were when you were a child. And we also have this phenomenon that we're increasingly aware of, which is gymnastics. Youth, boys and girls, tend to do quite advanced skills, handstands, back bends, all types of flexibility, but then maybe they stop doing that and they can't come back to it as easily as they could in their adult years. So flexibility is definitely a confusing world, and I think that the anatomy, or what's under the surface, is important in adding context and real tangible information to a situation that is more or less like just word of mouth. A teacher might suggest that you do a stretch a certain way. Or you may literally, for most of your physical training, just follow someone else's advice, follow someone else's routine. And I want you to have the ability, or at least understanding, of what's under the surface enough that you can feel confident in navigating your own flexibility. That's definitely my goal. Navigate your own flexibility. See awesome improvements and really just see awesome results. So we're going to talk about hip positioning. And now everybody can be generally familiar with the basics of the hips, right? So we have the pelvis at an anterior view, we have the pelvis at a posterior view, and then a lateral view, okay? So we can also think in the moment, we know what the pelvis should do positionally for handstand. We have anterior and posterior tilt. And then we know that we have femurs that come out of the pelvis, and that the tissues, the ligaments keeping the femurs in place, are what allow us to stand up, walk around, move through space, okay? So I'm going to change the position here, and I'm going to talk through what we have on the board here. So hip position. we have two pelvises. One, we have an anterior view, okay? So excuse my poor artwork, but we have an anterior view. Focus on this for now. So we have the upper and lower quadrants of the pelvis. This is airspace. You would see through the pelvis here. Okay, this would be like your perineal muscles, you know, that area. And then the anterior view, what you can't see is the pubic bone, but you can see the two bottom disc shapes of the ischium. Ischium is the lower portion of the pelvis, and then the pubic bone is in front, and then the ilium is the upper quadrant of the pelvis. So they're actually like mirror images. The ilium, the upper quadrant, is the bigger half of the pelvis. We have the spine coming out of the center. And then we have the femur, the femoral head, which is this ball and socket, the round portion of the femur that inserts into the pelvic socket. And then we have the greater trochanter, which is this sort of portion of the femur that juts out laterally and helps to create a strong, rigid structure that allows the body to absorb energy and contributes to the strength, the vertical strength of the femur. The femur is the biggest bone in the body. So, you know, evolution has helped us in many ways, allowing us to run, walk, and jump. And evolution has evolved the femur to be what it is. And so the hip socket works in 360 degrees of rotational capacity. More or less, it is at its resting point when we're standing or laying down and the body is vertically aligned. Okay, so keeping that in mind, shift over to this view. Now, this is the right lateral side, right lateral view of the pelvis. This is like the butterfly shape that everybody associates with the pelvis. You can see that it's symmetrical, that what we can see through, it's quite a big structure, and I always think of it like Mickey Mouse ears. The ilium is the Mickey Mouse ears, and the ischium is the Minnie Mouse ears. Now, from the side, it's a bit more confusing. Obviously, the ilium is still the larger portion, and it creates this sort of, just like I said, big ear shapes that flare out to the sides. And then we have the central point. And for every major segment of the body, so the hips, there is a central point, central to most of the rotation that happens and the center of gravity for that segment of the body. And I'll explain a bit more about that in a few minutes. So the pelvis has been turned to the right. You're now looking at the bone from the right side. We have the pubis that I talked about earlier. This forms the front anterior, and then the ischium is actually quite a bit lower and to the rear, the posterior side, which makes sense. We have the femur. So the femoral head is actually, as you can see here, the femoral head is actually slightly superior to the greater trochanter. So I've drawn two circles slightly offset and the femur exiting vertically from there. Okay, so also very rough drawing. You know, not the greatest artist here, but keep in mind too that the ischium and the pubis share this lower segment of the pelvis, but that there also is airspace here. Now, what we have to deduce from all this is that pelvic positioning for flexibility positions, lower body flexibility, is extremely important. What I don't have here is the ligament and soft tissue holding the body together. Okay, so between every joint there is cartilage. It allows you to move around freely, pain-free, smooth surface on smooth surface. Then there are ligaments, spiral wrapped around the joint in order to keep it in place and keep its resting tension in the position that evolution has allowed to be the resting position. In this case, it's vertical. I'm sitting here. I would be lying down on my back, and this would be the resting position. Okay. So, as I continue, a couple things to keep in mind. The greater trochanter presents itself in a vertical position against the ilium as a point of a very important point for flexibility, that is, because as abduction occurs, which is femur moving out and away from the midline of the body, the greater trochanter will cause impingement against the ilium. Now, this is super important because as we know from the right side, as we shift the body, so this is the right side of the body, just like this, as we shift the pelvis forward, meaning this direction, but we allow the femur to remain in its vertical alignment, which I'll demonstrate in a moment, we allow the greater trochanter to move past the ilium, or at least closer to the midline of the body, without impinging on the other parts of the pelvic structure. So I hope this is making sense. This is why pelvic positioning is the first and most important piece in any lower body flexibility training regime that we're doing, okay? Another thing to keep in mind, we have the major muscle groups responsible for forward and backward motion, posterior and anterior flexibility and strength. The things that allow us to move forward and move backwards, primarily the anterior side of the hip and the posterior side of the hip. So posterior, two big muscle groups, hamstrings, glutes. Anterior, we have the quadriceps and the hip flexors, okay? Responsible for pulling the leg up. Then we have the vastus medialis and vastus lateralis, which are responsible for knee extension and flexion. I'm sorry, knee extension. Then hamstrings are also responsible for knee flexion. Okay, so briefly, we know that the hip can move in abduction and adduction. Adduction, adduction. And we know the hip can move front and back, flexion, extension. So I'm going to show you now. But we know 360 degrees is possible. All right. So we have hip abduction, moving away from the midline of the body. Hip abduction. Then we have hip adduction, adduction, adduction. I remember this as AB out or ab out and add in. AD in, AB out. I've just used it enough times that I know. We also have hip flexion, flexion, and hip extension, hip extension. So, things I'm using for flexion, hip flexor, glutes, hamstrings, flexion, or excuse me, extension. So all the glute is designed to do is go into end range extension, end range extension. So now you can see how this is important for walking and running. Okay? Another key thing here. when you are, let's say, working towards middle splits and pancakes, we'll talk about front splits in a minute, but middle splits and pancakes, we are stretching, training the strength flexibility of the adductors and the hamstrings. Because there is a certain degree of pelvic flexion that occurs, as well as hip abduction for the movement, we're recruiting hamstrings and adductors, okay? The balance between those is dependent on your unique body structure, your genetic potential, your past experience, and all of that. Wait for the phone to stop. So, we're going to put this in the context of movements first, and we're going to start with the easy one. Standing pike. It's very common that people associate standing pike with reach for your toes. So if I was to just reach for the toes, this is why it's a bad cue. I can do it, but you see that the back has a rounding position to it, rounding lower back, okay? This is not stretching the hamstrings. A reach for your toes should be, or a forward pike is a hamstring flexibility demonstration, and this is not stretching the hamstrings. Why? Because I'm not accounting for the pelvic position that is important here. The attachments of the hamstrings to the pelvis happen on the rear, happen on the back. Duh. How do I put those muscles in a lengthened position? I must prioritize hip and pelvic position, guys. So, first thing I'm going to do in my standing pike is not reach. I'm going to tip the hips into anterior. So already I'm lengthening the hamstring here. As opposed to a neutral position or even a posterior tilt, I'm lengthening the hamstrings. And the first thing I'm doing is sticking the butt out and trying to continually shift the pelvis forward and into an anterior position. Okay? So already, when I get here, pretty much as far as I can go in that anterior tilt, hamstrings are far more lengthened or stretched than they were in the previous position. And look at that, I can't even touch the ground yet. The cue I want you to remember is tilt the pelvis forward as if you're turning the pelvis while keeping the femur in place, which you're doing. And I want you to think about sticking your butt out, keeping your chest up, and your lower back flat or arched in reverse, okay? The other thing you're going to notice is that the belly button reaches for the quads first. We're keeping our knees straight here, sticking our butt out. And then we can flex the spine a bit more, and we get for that. We go for that actual pike, okay? But if we're just going reach, 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 we never get anywhere because we never learn to associate anterior tilt with a forward position. Okay, so that's reverse. Same thing in hip extension, which would be a back bridge, okay, or the couch stretch. I'm going to turn here just a little bit, guys, and push this back. So couch stretch, the reason this is so important, if I'm going through the couch stretch here, which is hip extension, I'm going to put the knee up to the couch. Yes, literally I'm using the couch. I'm going to set up like this. I'm going to move this front leg out into a leverage position here. I'm going to start in a lunge. So I'm moving away. This is a stretch already, but I want to get up tall. And the goal here is first to flex the glute, because the glute is responsible for driving the hip into extension. So the hip is not going anywhere because the knee's touching the ground. So the hip goes forward, right? I'm sticking my butt out here, butt out here. Then I'm going to drive the hip under. Soon as I flex the glute, I feel a productive stretch across the front of the leg, the quad, and the hip flexor. I'm going to keep that position tight with the glute, tight, 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 flex, flex, flex the glute, and this is where I'm driving through the front leg and pushing back towards the heel. But I'm never losing this position here, never letting the butt, the glute sink back towards the heel. I'm keeping that posterior tilt. Hold that. Okay, another great way to feel hip extension, because this is a commonly unknown position. So pelvic position again. This is totally from my PT days a year ago now. Okay, so I'm gonna lay on the ground, elbows up, whatever feels right to you. I'm pretty neutral, straightforward. I'm gonna lift one leg, point that toe, and I'm going to use that side, the butt, glute on that side, to lift the knee off the ground, but not arch or twist the body. Okay? Up, lift the knee. So essentially just squeezing the glute, but keeping the front of the pelvis glued to the floor. Boom. Boom. All I'm doing is using that 5 or 10 degree range of motion to drive the hip off of the ground. Okay? If you ever do back bends or you see a contortionist do back bends, they have developed fantastic hip extension. You must be able to control hip extension in order to not put all the load in the lower back when you are bending. Okay? So, final demonstration of the, forget where we started. I guess we're doing forward bends. Started with pike, we did hip extension. So hip flexion, hip extension, showed you the face down drill for hip extension. Now we're talking about front splits and how we want to utilize the hip position knowledge for front split. Okay, so I'm going to use my right leg back and left leg forward so that you can see what I'm doing. Okay, so as I choose this long lunge position, this is not actually how I would typically get into the front split. So how I would get into the front split is this long lunge position with an open more than 90 degrees at the front leg. And the first thing I'm doing is just finding the ilium on both sides, the outside of the pelvis, and I'm familiarizing my hands with where those are, where that is. And what I want to pay attention to is, am I at a rotation? Am I actually facing the camera when I should be facing straight forward? I want my hips to be 90 degrees, perfectly perpendicular to the front leg, okay? From here, I'm going to actually shift backwards, allowing that front knee to extend, open up, and my goal is to maintain a forward hip position as I go into the front split. So this is going to be very hard. I'm not perfect at it. Total truth, I'm not perfect at it. I can probably have a straight position here, and then as I sink, I start to compensate a bit more, and I can because I have flexible hamstrings, but I lack flexibility in hip extension and the hip flexor. So I have what's called a functional front split. Functional front split meaning I can sit in it, and it is a technical front split, but I do not have a structural front split because I'm not 50% stretch on the hamstring and 50% hip flexor. I'm more like 70-30 or 60-40. But while I'm here, I am again finding the hips, thinking, okay, how close am I to perpendicular with the front leg? Is my right side open a bit? If so, how can I change that position? Well, I can flex the glute to try and drive the front of the pelvis down towards the floor. I can sit up tall pull the left glute back a little bit and get as close as I can to that position. What you'll find is it's not a resting position at all. It's an active position. But this is the correct structural front split that I want you to be shooting for, that accounts for the pelvic positioning for splits, for forward folds, and for the hip extension. And lastly, in a front split, the pelvis should be relatively straight up and down. We're not even talking about AD or abduction at this point. We're just talking about flexion and extension. And there are no impingements to worry about in that situation. Normally, it's really just flexibility of hamstrings and flexibility of hip flexors. Okay, so really quick, let's take a 2-minute break, and then we'll go into abduction after that. All right, back with it. Abduction and adduction. Excuse me for the continual pauses. And the reason, of course, that I have my shirt off is because I want you to see my spine and rib and chest and torso positioning throughout the demonstrations. They're super important. So let's talk about abduction and adduction. Again, AB. I say AB because AD and AB can sound the same. So abduction is out, middle splits, pancake. Adduction is together, legs together, side by side, laterally compressed together. So you have strength in both positions. The adductors are what adduct the legs together. These are what keep us from sliding out and apart, like we're Gumby. And you can, for a little experiment here, display force in both positions. So you can do force at legs together, squeeze the legs together, feet together, side by side by side. Then you can also display force in a lengthened position, like a middle split. You can be here and crunch the feet in together, and you're displaying force on the adductors. One is in a shortened range of motion, legs together, and one is in a lengthened range of motion. Now, this is super important because this is where the pelvis positioning really comes into play, and we have to be mindful of what the pelvis looks like now that you can imagine it, what it looks like and feels like right inside all of this muscle and ligament in the hips and the femurs, and you know that that greater trochanter exists and that it will bump into bone if you do not change the hip positioning. Now, the question comes up, how far forward do I have to tilt the pelvis? And there is no one answer. The answer is it depends. My pelvis is slightly different than yours, hers, whatever, everybody else's. And you have to be responsible for finding the position that works for you, whether or not that's tilted all the way forward or tilted just, a couple degrees forward. Plenty of examples all over social media of dancers. I always look to dancers for this because they have great active flexibility, and they've usually been training since they were kids, but they can do perfect 180-degree middle splits, right? Active position with seemingly no pelvic tilt, And so the truth is, guys, in most cases, the pelvic tilt is very obvious when the person has some middle split mobility. I'll use myself as an example, but not perfect middle split mobility. When you go again all the way to the extreme, which is 180-degree middle split, then it almost like it becomes hard to observe the pelvic tilt that's happening for the person, because it seems like they don't need any pelvic tilt, that they just have that range of motion. And the truth is they don't. They're still engaging pelvic tilt. They're still changing the position of the pelvis so that they don't hit bone on bone, but their bodies are conditioned in totally different ways and into coming into flexibility as an adult, it's very important to understand this so we can avoid pain, so we can avoid injury, so that we can avoid plateaus that last forever. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to demonstrate is we're just going to talk about the pancake position. So the pancake is one on everybody's list that we should be working towards, largely because it's relevant to the handstand press. And it incorporates some flexibility from the hamstrings and the adductors at the same time. And that's a key point here. Right now, the legs are roughly 90 degrees of abduction. 90 degrees of abduction. At 90 degrees, there is a pretty good balance between adductor stretch and hamstring stretch, right? The position of the pelvis is I still have to tip it forward, so that lengthens the hamstrings, but it also, as I'm traveling forward, stretches the adductors, okay? As I push the legs wider, I get more adduction and less hamstring. Same thing forward, I get less adductor and more hamstring, okay? So if I'm sitting in a pike position here, I'm going to shift forward by coming from an upright position. You can see the change in the back. We're going to drop forward. It's more like my belly comes to my quads first. Hands are up, out. I can reach for my feet, but I'm pulling forward through the pelvis. Okay, I'm not pulling down. Forward through the pelvis. Same thing as I go into 45 degrees. The first thing I want to do is sit up tall. And you can tell when a person can do this properly because they're up tall and you see them go from this position, which is just bad posture, lazy, to up tall, neutral, and then actually forward just a bit. Not really like forward stretching, but shifted forward in the pelvis. And this is like 30% of the stretch already, 50% of the stretch already. You have to get here to do any work. Let me say that again. You have to get here to do any work. How do you regress this? I would highly, highly recommend that you either raise the butt, so now you have gravity working for you, still 90 degrees of abduction occurring, and I'm just going to practice going from a rounded back, posterior tilt, up tall, forward, anterior. Up tall, forward, anterior. Okay? Not even moving forward. In fact, my body can stay roughly upright in the same position. Up tall, forward roll, aiming that belly button at the ground below you. Okay? Get that down. You can also do that, just for the sake of demonstration, in a seated good morning. Seated good morning. So I'm here, up tall, and at this point, I need to keep coming forward just like my pike, and I'm able to shift forward a little bit. But a couple things are happening too. I'm keeping externally rotated feet. If I allow them to internally rotate, then I'm not accounting for the femoral, greater trochanter, and I will have this problem of the greater trochanter hitting or impinging on the ilium or parts of the pelvis, even just soft tissue. So let me stand up and demonstrate this. I'm going to go from this position tall in abduction. Again, butt out. Right here, 90 degrees. And right here is where you should have the most access to a lower middle split position. But the moment you come here and you come up, I can't return to a full neutral position because I cannot abduct the legs that far in a neutral position. So once I'm here, I'm past the point of, I have now, in that position, rotated the pelvis forward, and the greater trochanter has come out into abduction and behind the ilium. And then if I try and rotate the pelvis back up without changing the angle of abduction, then I run into the greater trochanter, or the soft tissue between the two, the glutes, and so on. Okay? Hope this is making sense. One more test I want to show you guys is a very simple but effective demonstration. So I'm going to give you the best view, I hope. If you're laying straight down on your back, you should be able to see the test pretty clearly, feel the test. I'm just going to go straight into abduction, far out as I can. That's about 90 degrees. It's what I can tolerate. I can go out an inch or two more if I lift my legs. But already, I can feel my back arching, so my low back comes off the floor. And actually, if I flatten my low back, my hips, my legs come in a little bit. Now, I can't get any wider than that in this position, but I can get wider if I don't change the pelvic position. I change the femur position around the pelvis up to 90 degrees, and there's much more abduction happening now, a much wider into a straddle, because the femoral head and the greater trochanter are no longer impinging on the ilium, the crest of the ilium, on the pelvis. Okay? Show you that again. Here, I'm going to go out into abduction. Out into abduction. You can see how wide that is. And then away here. Much wider. Okay. So, that is the gist of the middle split and adduction. I'm trying to think if I want to demonstrate anything else. I guess there's one more thing I want to show you. Entry to middle split is pretty important. And when we talk about getting into middle splits, going low into maximum abduction, we need to have a good system of getting low with the right hip position and then pushing out into middle splits. We need to get into the right hip position first in order that we get the most out of the middle split stretch the quickest, okay? So from here, what I would do is I would go into my 3 or 5 step horse stance. Let's go 5 step. I'd go low, and already you can see my butt's back, and I'm in that anterior pelvic tilt. I'm going to drop the hands, come forward and wait a little bit, and then I'm just going to straighten the legs out to the side and sink down from here. But my butt's still out, very much so. And even if I tilt the heels up into external rotation, I should keep the hips down. And there's this sort of maximum external rotation range that you hit. But if you were to internally rotate, you can try, but my guess is you're going to feel quite a bit of discomfort as you internally rotate against the pelvis. Here, sink down. Okay. So that's entry. Quick recap, we talked about entry, abduction, and adduction, how angles matter relative to the anatomical context of the pelvis and the femur, why this shit matters, right? Talked about the 2 demonstrations of upright neutral position, and then changing the position 90 degrees, laying on your back into straddle, and how much difference there is in abduction. We talked about pancake and the importance of shifting the hips forward into anterior pelvic tilt, lengthening the hamstrings. Then jumping back, we talked about hip extension. We talked about front splits, structural and functional. And we talked about forward fold. And then back before that, we talked about the actual anatomy. One last key point I want to leave you with, guys, is that there are no tissues that span from one limb, one lower limb, leg, to the other, okay? To the other. They are not together. They're not bound together. There is no tissues that span across the pubic bone to the other, meaning all those adductors, they attach at the pubic bone and they attach at their attachment on the leg, okay? So what this means is there is no tissue stopping you from going into a full middle split. There's no anatomical restriction other than the shape of your pelvis and femur and your genetic capacity to rotate and abduct as far as your bones and tissues let you go. But there is nothing innate to humans that stops us going 180 degrees, okay? So, I know this has been quite a bit of lecture, but hopefully some stuff that you can tag along with, flexibility-wise, just do some tests yourself. I will write up a short contents for the video so that people can skip around, and otherwise, I hope you've enjoyed the presentation for this week on pelvic positioning and flexibility secrets. This stuff was all big to me 5 years ago. And it's made a huge difference. It's made all the difference in my flexibility training, and especially my teaching too, because now I understand what's under the surface. You guys have got to understand what's under the surface. Peace. Catch you next week.